Folks, welcome back to a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. And it's an honor to have Bill Cutler back on the program. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks, good to be here.
I wanted to ask you, we didn't get into this last time, but when you got out to Northern California, how did you connect with David Ray, Slewfoot?
Well, when I first got out here, I was looking to do some demos of my own material. And I decided that I really needed to find the right engineer. And I loved the sound of records that had just come out, like American Beauty, that Stephen Barncard had engineered.
Absolutely.
So I asked around, got some contact information for Steve Barncard, and spoke with him and asked him if he'd do a demo with me. And he said, yeah, he would. I played him a few tunes. We went in the studio at a place called Funky Features. We cut, 5 or 6 of my songs. And that demo tape started floating around Marin County. And David Ray had come down from Canada. He had co-written Mississippi Queen with Mountain, which was at that point in the early 70s, 71, 72, a big record and a huge single. And David had gotten signed by Clive Davis to a recording contract on Columbia. But Clive wanted him to have a band.
Right.
So for some reason or other, Bobby Weir and David heard my tape. They liked a couple of songs on there, and I wound up being one of the guys auditioning for David's band as a result of that demo tape that Steve and I had made.
Wow.
And, there were a lot of people auditioned, but eventually he came up with a band. It was Matthew Kelly, who was later in Kingfish, and Chris Harold, who was later in Kingfish, and myself on rhythm guitar, and James Aykroyd on bass from James and the Good Brothers, one of the bands that had been on the Festival Express,
Right.
And so we put the band David Ray and Slewfoot together, and we were the band that actually made the record for Columbia. So that's how I got involved. Some of the recording had been done already by the time I got involved, but there were still some tracks to be cut, so I was on some of the record.
Well,
and after that,
yeah, go ahead.
The band started to do quite well, and we played the Columbia Records Convention with the Sons of Champlin and Copperhead and all these other bands that were on the CBS roster. And right at that moment, which was about this point, was probably 73 or something when the record was done, Clive Davis was fired as the president of Columbia, and therefore all these record acts were dropped from Columbia, and we were one of the ones that were dropped, and that was pretty much the end of that band.
Well, how come it says in your notes that cats like Godchow and Dryden and Charles Lloyd were in that band? Were they on the album?
Well, they were on the album. The band that actually played out was Matthew on harmonica and guitar and other things. And David Ray, who was the lead singer and on guitar. Myself on rhythm guitar and vocals. We were the band, but James Aykroyd on bass. But on the record, because Bob Weir was co-producing it, and because Barncard was engineering it, we had access to all these wonderful players. So on different tracks, like Keith Godchow played on one track, and John Kahn would play on one track, and Charles Lloyd would play on one track, and it was an amazing experience. We did it up at the Record Plant in Sausalito, which was a brand new studio then, and a lot of those guys came in as guests on it. It was really an exciting experience,
I mean, it was like, it was like, we need a horn on this tune. Like, did somebody know Lloyd? Did Bobby know Lloyd?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I remember him coming and playing.
Right.
I don't remember who contacted him, but all of those people were available because, Bobby hadn't really been producing records up to that point. And I think a lot of people wanted to work with him. And Barncard had done an awful lot of records. He was doing Crosby's solo album, If I Could Only Remember My Name.
Oh, yeah.
He had done American Beauty, and he was working with people like Joni Mitchell. So he was going down to L.A. as well. So his reach was pretty extensive, And all those guys were, in one way or another, in their musical orbit.
Going back for a minute, it's funny, when did you connect with Jerry and Yorma? I remember Yorma told me a story where he was in New York, as you were, really didn't like the vibe there, and went out to I forget the college's name, but he wound up at a hoot. He saw this sign. It just said, Hootenanny, here at this club in San Jose, and he went down. It was Janice and it was Jerry, and one thing that's really interesting about you were part of this dynamic folk scene. A ton of cats that I've gone after, in New York, and now you also connected with that individualistic style in the Bay. But I think you might have come out a little bit later, right? I mean, you came out for the Summer of Love.
Yeah, I came out the first time at sort of the tail end of the Summer of Love, late in '67. I had grown up in Manhattan, right? I had been a folk singer in Greenwich Village and sort of begun writing my own songs. I was 17 or so, and I had been knocking around everywhere on the Brill Building trying to get a publisher interested in me, that kind of thing. At the same time, playing in all of the standard clubs in the village at night, the Gaslight Cafe, the Cafe Wa, the Bitter End, the Four Winds, all the basket houses. And then I came out here around 67 to look around and then I went back to the East Coast once or twice, came back out in 68, and I made my final move in 70. But I didn't meet Yorma for many, many years after that.
Really?
I met all the people in the Dead and the Riders and even the guys in Moby Grape long before I got to know Yorma. I actually got to know Yorma in the 80s because I was working with a band called Vauxhall that Michael Falzerano was the leader of.
Wow.
Who these days is part of the reconstituted New Riders of the Purple Sage.
Oh, that's cool.
But in those days was doing Vauxhall. And Yorma was a friend of Michael's. Yorma came in to play on Vauxhall's record as a guest artist, play one track, a thing called Daytime Nightmare, and he was going to play the solo. And I was so excited, And so we tracked that one song together, and that's how I got to know him. And we hit it off on that experience. And years later, when I was doing my own record, I gave Yorma a call and asked him if he wanted to play on it, and he said yes. So that was sort of how I connected with Yorma, was through Michael. And Michael's on my record too. Michael and I are great friends to this day.
Oh yeah, no, that cat is awesome. Anyway, that's interesting how because I don't know, it was just. Did you feel the same? Well, you were. I mean, he had a fingerpick style, but he didn't play it the way his elders played it. So they gave him a very hard time. I mean, did you find the East Coast vibe? I mean, by 70, you were like, I'm gone. You just like you just were not into it, or is it just it was more intoxicating?
Well, by the time I came out here in 1970, I was already convinced that I wanted to be in the electric scene, not the acoustic scene. I mean, from the moment that I saw, I went to see Bob Dylan at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium like 2 weeks after he plugged in for the first time at the Newport Folk Festival. And that was sort of the demarcation point for me between folk and folk rock. Because when Dylan plugged in and came out with the band at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium, even though the crowd booed I loved it. I thought it was fantastic, you know, even though there were those people who
Why did you think it was fantastic?
betraying the folk scene.
Yeah.
Right?
Can you explain why you thought it was fantastic?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, I just saw the fact that Dylan was unafraid to follow his own vision, no matter where it took him, and even if it threatened to lose him the mantle of being sort of the voice of the generation. He was just going to do what he believed in, and that changed my idea forever of what I thought the real purpose of being an artist was. That it wasn't to make people comfortable, it wasn't to, you know, attain something, it was to have the integrity to do what you really believed in. And I decided that those were the kinds of artists I was interested in. Yorma was that kind of an artist.
Right.
I mean, Yorma was a dedicated acoustic guitar player, but he got into the airplane, and he found a way to make his kind of music fit into that when he switched to electric, you know? So you have all those great things like Embryonic Journey, and you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. This is great, man. No, I was going to say, because I mean, the original band 2 weeks before was with Harvey Brooks, and I talked to him about that, and Al Cooper. But this outfit was Danko, Robbie, and Levon. Levon was on drums that night, the original night that Dylan plugged in. But this was the
right.
This was the band.
Right. Harvey Brooks was playing bass.
Right.
And you know, we're going back to 1965.
I mean, all I know is that the original lineup was Al Cooper. Yeah. Either way, Levon, for him to be the drummer must have been unbelievably classic.
Right. Exactly.
Unbelievable.
It was. And you know, it's really, that had as much to do with what formed me as anything that happened in California. It was really the combination. I thought that the sound, when I heard the band backing up Dylan, you know, that kind of powerful lyrical rock with all these amazing images, and at the same time, you know, being able to put it over in a stadium, whereas up to that point, rock and roll had been, you know, much more boy, girl, moon, spoon, tune, kind of Venus, that kind of nonsense. Frankie Avalon.
Yeah.
And at least there'd been that period from after Elvis and before the Beatles.
Sure.
You know? And now this whole thing was changing. So the merging of folk rock really was a big deal. And to me, that's where I began to understand that you could do more with music. And of course, the Dead was another step. You know, seeing what they were doing and hearing the Hunter Garcia tunes, they were like the Dylan tunes again. They were they were much further along lyrically than the kind of people that I had.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're further along than anything going on today, you know? I mean, they were way ahead. Can you talk about the Columbia Record Convention show with the Sons when you were with Slewfoot?
Well, the Columbia Records Convention that we went to in '73 was held at a place called the Orphanage in San Francisco, and it was a big club. But it was in the days when the record companies would spend obscene amounts of money to put something like a convention on. So they transformed the place. They took the stage and they added to the stage that was huge. They had tons of food, and they invited all kinds of additional press and stuff. And they put the bill together that was going to play there. And it was, you know, Sons of Champlin topping the bill, who I thought were an amazing band. Mm-hmm. John Cipollini's band Copperhead, which was the band he was in after Quicksilver Messenger Service.
Right.
Our band, David Ray and Slewfoot, a band called Gentlehood, and probably 2 or 3 others that opened the show under them. You know what I mean? I remember who all of our headline acts were, but I'm sure that there were several acts that played even before we did. And it was just an amazing affair. I mean, we had finished the record with Bobby and Steve, and all those people were there, and we were being managed at the time by Bud Prager and Felix Pappalardi. And Felix Pappalardi, of course, was famous for all kinds of things. working with Cream and all these other bands. And Bud Prager went on to manage Foreigner. He was a big-time manager. And everything was looking terrific. And it really wasn't, it was right after that, Clive was fired.
Wow.
And we were dropped. We had a record that was starting to charge and all the rest of it. But when the new regime came in at Columbia, they just didn't want anything to do with anybody that wasn't already a superstar. So the bands that Clive Davis had signed that were major acts, like Simon and Garfunkel and Sly and the Family Stone and,
Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Whatever.
Yeah.
They were all kept.
Yeah.
But all these other bands, including the Sons of Champlin and Copperhead, and bands that I considered tremendously successful from my point of view, were all dropped together. So my time on Columbia Records was very, very limited. And it was an exciting thing, but other than playing a few shows and doing the convention, finishing the record, we were gone and just sort of thrown to the wind. I had formed a really strong friendship with Matthew Kelly and Chris Harold, and Matthew and Chris and I went on to do a lot of recording together after that.
Oh, yeah, believe me. Let me tell you something, man. One of the spiritual things about this journey is like connecting with you, but then having really no idea that you were close with Matt Kelly, because, I realized, I was like, a lot of the guys in the Dead now are, they're pretty isolated, and that wasn't the case 40, 50 years ago. And so I started to look around to these, just to triangulate. And I was like, where is Matthew Kelly? And I look him up. This is like 2 years ago. And he was, it was some philanthropic thing, email. And I sent him this email, I do a radio show. I'd love to have you come on. And I didn't hear from him for like 2 months. And then he emailed me. He's like, Jake, I would love to. He's like, this is not a good email to get me at. Try me this one. He was in Thailand. He's still there. And we did an epic interview. We did not talk about Slewfoot, but this is a guy. One thing that blew my mind about Matt Kelly was that he was, he told the story about Mel Brown, the great blues guitar player. About Mel, basically, he got up on stage one night, he was out of his mind, and he ripped off this harp solo, and next thing you know, he's down in Mel's crib in Watts, and he toured the country with, I think it was John Lee Hooker. He was a monster. T-Bone Burnett, and I'm like, and then now Cutler comes into the picture, and I'm like, my heart's just warm because I haven't talked to Matthew in a while because he was in Frisco, then he broke his ribs. The guy is out of control. He was cracking me up. He was bloody honest about a lot of things as it related to...
what happened, when I met Matthew, it was through both of us winding up in David Ray and Slewfoot. And even though, and the same with Chris Harold. And even though that didn't last that long, the friendship between Chris and Matthew and I lasted many, many years. And what happened was, after we got out of there, we said, well, we want to do something exciting. Well, Matthew was the most developed artist among the three of us because he had been on the Chitlin circuit with John. He played with everyone.
Yeah.
But T-Bone Burnett, he had T-Bone Walker. I mean, why am I saying you were?
Yeah, it's funny. I was T-Bone Walker.
T-Bone Walker.
T-Bone Walker, yeah.
And he wanted to do a blues album. So he and I and Chris went into the studio at the record plant in Sausalito, and we started cutting tracks. So this is now around 73, 74, right in that zone. And we started to put together an album for Matthew that would be a kind of a blues harmonica featured record with lots of guests on it. And
awesome.
Bit by bit, we started cutting tracks. And Matthew wanted to cut a couple of my songs. We had a song we had written together called Dangerous Relations, and he wanted to cut that one. And I had my song Riding High, which he loved and wanted to cut. So when it came time to cut those two songs, the band we put together to cut those two songs was me and Bobby Weir on acoustic guitars, Matthew on harmonica, Chris Harold on drums, Dave Torbert from the New Riders of the Purple Sage on bass, a keyboard player named Mick Ward, and Garcia on lead guitar.
Oh my God!
I said I'd love to have Jerry come in and play on this, and I asked Bobby if he would see if Jerry could come. And I had met Jerry back in '68. I had spoken to him a little bit, but we hadn't played together. And Bobby said, "I'll give him a call." And Jerry said, "Yeah, I'd like to do it. Sure, I'll come down." So we had the session at the plant to cut those 2 songs in one day, and it was a noon session. I got there at noon. Jerry got there at noon, and nobody else got there till 1:30. So I had an hour and a half to sit around with Jerry and play my songs. And we sat there with a couple of guitars, and in no time at all, we really bonded. He did some beautiful stuff on it. By the time the other guys came in to play on it, he knew the song so well that he was helping me assign parts and helping Matthew produce and all the rest of it, and we cut those songs that day. And at the time, Jerry said, "Hey, a lot of fun. If you ever do something else on your own, let me know. I'd love to be on it." I mean, people say that all the time in the music business. You don't necessarily believe it's going to happen, but he did. And we got a lot of tracks cut. Meanwhile, we also cut tracks with Bloomfield. We had Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee come in and cut a track. We had John Lee Hooker come in and cut a track. I mean, we just went to town at the record plant. But after a while, the record plant started saying, "Hey, you guys, we're giving you all this time. You're bringing in all these well-known people. We're not giving you these tapes right now. You're going to have to come up with some money." And things got, stressed out, and we let the tapes sit there. And Matthew and Chris began to put together Kingfish. And I, really wasn't the right rhythm guitar player, lead singer for Kingfish, because it was going to be a blues-oriented band, and my stuff isn't really blues. And this is before Bobby decided he wanted to be in the band. And then Bobby made the decision he wanted to be involved. So I stayed on the fringes of that, but they went on to do that. In the meantime, my relationship with Jerry was growing. And a year and a half later, when I went in to do my own record, the Grateful Dead were on hiatus. It was 1975. They were not playing for a year. I had a whole band put together to do my record. It was, Pat Campbell on bass, who's a wonderful bass player, still one of my great friends. A drummer that I had picked for the record, and Austin Malone playing some keyboards, and a number of different people. And Scotty Quick was the lead guitar player, who's a tremendous guitar player. And one night I was over at a Jerry Garcia and Merle Saunders show at Keystone Berkeley, and Jerry said, "Hey, I hear you're going to the studio." I said, "Yeah, in February I'm going to the studio to cut, some stuff, maybe half an album." He said, "Am I going to get to play?" I said, "You want to play?" He goes, "Yeah, I want to play."
That's awesome.
Said, "Well, I got a lead guitar player. I have Scotty, and he's a wonderful player." And he says, "Fine, that's good. Let's work together. How about 2? I said, "Okay."
I can't believe that. That's.
I don't know if you want to make rehearsals. And he goes, "Yeah, when's rehearsal?" And I said, "Well, we're going to do a little acoustic rehearsal at my house next Wednesday." So next Wednesday, Jerry shows up, and we start working on the material. And then we moved to an electric, rehearsal hall. And we went in February of '75. And again, I had Barncard as my engineer. And we cut half an album a couple of days because the band was really tight. And Jerry worked perfectly with the rest of the group. I mean, when Scotty wanted to do lead stuff, Jerry would back off. When Jerry had something great, Scotty was terrific. And, the band sounded great. We got half an album cut. We thought we were going to go back and cut the other half. And at that point, the Grateful Dead said, "Well, we're going to go back on the road. Our hiatus is over." So I kind of waited for a chance to go back in and do it, and never was another chance. I mean, I had half an album cut. It wasn't enough to do anything with in 1975. Mm-hmm. Everybody needed a full record. So those tapes sat in the closet for years and years while the Dead were out. And every once in a while, Jerry would ask me what was happening with them, and I'd tell him, "We're still waiting." But we never really got back to them. And sometime around 1993, Jerry, by this time, my brother was the house sound guy for both the Garcia Band and the Dead. And I went to the Warfield one night because I had gotten a record deal in another situation. And I brought that record in for Jerry to listen to. And he said, "Hey, what about the tapes from 18 years ago?" I said, "Well, they're sitting in my closet." He said, "Let's take them up to Front Street. Let's bake the original analog tapes, which is what you do to restore them.
Sure.
Let's transfer them to digital. Let's finish the record." And we did make the transfers, my brother and I, and Jeffrey Norman. But shortly after that, Jerry's health failed, and he was gone by 1995. And so I had to make the other half of that record without him. And that's when I decided to call Yorma and Jerry Miller and all the other great guitar players that I thought would be appropriate, to keep the vibe going on that record. And that's how that record got made. So it got made half in 1975 and half around 1998, 99,
Was it like, did you feel like you really, in your heart of hearts, wanted to have Garcia on the whole album?
Well, it would have been wonderful. But
I'm just saying, because I also
loved playing with all the other guitar players. I shouldn't fail to mention David Nelson from the New Riders. One of my favorites is on there. But the thing is, I loved playing with Jerry. It was a certain thing that we had. But when we went to do the other side of the record, we went back to a studio that had the same kind of a Neve board, the same kind of a Studer machine. We went fully analog so that it would sound very similar. I used a lot of the same players that I had on the first tracks, like Austin DeLone came back and played keyboards again. Pat Campbell played bass again. Dave Perper played drums, who had been my drummer on the road. So there were people there was a lot of continuity between all the stuff on the record. And even though Jerry was on 6 of the 14 tracks, the others were not wildly different in terms of stylistically or sonically,
Yeah, except it was 1975, the first half.
Right. Well, but the thing is, we had to take the 1975 tapes and we had to clean them up and do all kinds of work to make them sound wonderful. And I had a guy named Russell Bond, who was one of the very, very early adapters to Pro Tools, brilliant engineer, come in and help me clean up those tapes, but not take any of the juice or the soul out of them,
Mm-hmm.
That was a very difficult thing to do in the days that we did it. 1999, 2000, digital had not come to where it is 15 years later. So we were very careful because I did not want to make a record that sounded sterile with those people on it. At the same time, I had to make it sound wonderful so that it would be a joyful experience to listen to and not full of crackling and pops and, things like that. So it was a challenge, but we did it, and that's how that record got made.
How well, I just was doing some work on this before. The album that you were working on with Harold and Matthew, that was kind of a blues harmonica album. Did some of those cuts wind up going on to A Wing and a Prayer?
Yes, exactly.
Which ones? Because I sort of like there's like
some of the tracks from that album, along with some other things that Matthew did, became Wing and a Prayer. And that didn't come out till maybe 1980.
I think later than that, 85.
73
80, yeah, it was like 80. Yeah.
I think Relics eventually released.
Exactly.
And Riding High was on there. But that particular version of Riding High that came from those sessions had Bobby Weir singing lead, me and him on guitars, but, I had sung the lead vocal on it, and Matthew had also had Bobby do the lead vocal on it. I think on that version, Bobby sang it. And, A Dangerous Relations was on there, and other things like Patty Cathcart and Tuck and Patty was singing a song on the record, and they had the Mess Around, the old Ahmet Erdogan song. It was one of the first Ray Charles records. They had re-recorded that. And I think they had Mona, a version of Mona with Torbert singing. I mean, it was a kind of an amalgamation of things with Matthew. Some of the ones from the blues harmonica records, some of those tracks have never come out.
What?
Like, I remember recording the ones with John Lee Hooker and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and I don't think those tracks have ever been released. I could be wrong, but my recollection is they never actually have been released.
Is it like the record? What was it? The record plan you were at? They're hanging out at the tapes.
Yeah, it was the record plan in Sausalito, and then Matthew did some more work up at Bob Weir's home studio. You know, we had both done some recording there. Bobby had one of the very first home studios in Northern California, and it was designed very cleverly by Steve Barncart, and he also had Robbie Taylor do a lot of work there. Robbie is one of the production managers for the Grateful Dead, even to this day. And Robbie was, and the two of them, Steve and Robbie, wired up this wonderful studio at Bobby's Mill Valley home in the structure that was above his garage. And they did some work there, too. And, you know, the Dead did, I think, the basics, the blues for Allah there. But the test session, when that studio was first put together, was done by my band, Heroes. We were the guinea pigs, you know, and they fired it up, and we did some of the test sessions. And I think Matthew also cut some of Winging a Prayer there as well.
Yeah, so were there any, like, was Dangerous Relations, was there any remaking of that, or is there anything from the original session that was not tampered with on Winging a Prayer?
Well, Dangerous Relations is on Winging a Prayer. There's nothing that Jerry played on that hasn't come out.
No, what I'm getting at is like, what I'm saying is like, you sang lead on one tune, but then Bobby wound up on the record doing it. I mean, it was there.
Yes, well, then later on my record, I did Riding High with Jerry, and I wound up singing it, and, you know, on another version. So, yeah, I mean, the song Riding High of mine has come out 3 times. There's 2 versions with me singing it. One of them is on a Kingfish record called Sundown in the Forest, which is a more recent Kingfish record. And one is the version on my album, Crossing the Line. And then there's the one on Winging a Prayer. That song just sort of crept into people's consciousness, and it kept getting wound up, you know, on different records.
I love
winding
it.
up on different records
Yeah.
Over the years. The stuff that hasn't come out is really the blues-based stuff that Matthew tracked at the record plant in those early days. Some of that stuff has not come out. I think he also has some stuff with Johnny Johnson from Chuck Berry's band, the keyboard player.
Okay, so wait, I'm going to reach out. I'm going to get him going on this. Do you still talk to Matt at all?
I sure, of course, I talk to Matthew.
I'm gonna, because I that stuff would be epically. So John Lee Hooker was on those tracks, or one of those tracks?
Well, John Lee Hooker did one song. I know Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee did at least one. You're asking me to think back to 1970.
Yeah, no, you're pretty sharp, but I mean,
and I'm positive that that there was one song that we had. Let's see, there were a couple others on there. I know there's a song with Johnny Johnson.
Yeah.
I think there may be a version of one of my songs that Brent actually sang lead on. I'm not positive. You're going to have to ask Matthew to get the actual details on that stuff.
God, this is unbelievable.
I believe that exists too.
You talked very, very eloquently last time about a demarcation point. It's change in Jerry, just sort of his responsibility for the Dead, how he felt about it, the pressures that he had. Was there another one? Were there more demarcation points in your mind? You said that was a major one, but I'm just curious as we move
Well, I think each time there was a personnel change in the band, it was a huge thing. So each time there was a new keyboard lineup was a big thing. But I also think that there were changes in the Grateful Dead structure around the band. There were managers and eras, like there was an era when John McIntyre was more or less managing the band, and that had a certain flavor to it, and things like that. And there was an era when Rock Scully and Danny Rifkin, even earlier than that, were sort of the business people taking care of the band. At a different point, different people would come in. So there were a lot of different things, but I think that I really think that there was the early Grateful Dead. This is just my way of looking at it. From when they stopped being the Warlocks until, say, they got to the point of getting ready to record Working Man's Dead. And then the period between the Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, the 69, 70, from that point on till about Egypt, that was another phase. And then when they came back from Egypt and they had some new ideas, that was another phase. Remember, in the middle of all that, in the middle 70s, they formed their own record company. They really tried something radical. They said, instead of being signed to Warner Brothers or another major corporate operation, they were going to have Round Records and Grateful Dead Records.
Right.
And they did. And they had Ron Rakow involved, and they actually put out quite a few albums on their own. And the first Kingfish album in '76 was on Round Records, as were other albums. And during that time, they were doing, I don't know if Wake of the Flood was the beginning of that, but it was right around that time.
You're darn right. That was on Grateful Dead Records, yeah.
Yeah, so it was around then. And that created a whole nother layer of responsibility and bureaucracy that I think was exhausting for everybody. Because, when you take on that kind of thing, in those days, there was no roadmap for that. I mean, there were no bands that had their own record labels. It's not so radical today. I mean, people like Taylor Swift are involved with her own label, Big Machine Records, but this was unheard of then. And, of course, it was challenging and probably frightening to the corporations because the band was getting bigger, and if the bands had found a way to be free of all that control, who knows where that would have taken things. But eventually the Dead made the new deal with Arista, and so that was the end of yet another era and the beginning of a new era. Because once they got on Arista, they had a partner in Clive Davis, and he certainly was a force to be reckoned with. He wanted certain things done, and he wanted them to make records on a time schedule rather than when they felt like going in the studio. And, of course, he didn't have the power to make them do that, which is why there was that 7-year break between Go to Heaven and In the Dark.
Well, so I know, because I really want to. This is fascinating.
Can come out.
How did your brother connect with the Dead originally?
Well, he was friends with a very clever engineer, inventor guy named Ron Wickersham. Way back, I'm going to say, probably 1971.
Right.
And Ron was one of the people who was developing new technology and was tied with the Dead. And I think that maybe he was the one that actually brought my brother into that fold. But it was a kind of an organic thing, The Grateful Dead, like I said, were not inaccessible in those days. And if they hired you to do something, you did a good job, you'd get called back. And my brother was one of those kids who grew up with a tremendous understanding of electronics and a great mind for that. And so when they needed amps repaired, when they needed things developed, you know, at the time that Doug Irwin was starting to make Jerry's guitars, they wanted to put some devices in the guitar that would keep it at line level and lower the hum. And John was the kind of guy who could sit down and breadboard that and invent it. And so he kind of came in through that angle, as opposed to being a well-known recording engineer or something like that.
But he,
more from the electronic side.
He sounds like he was, and maybe this is just my naivety, but he sounds more like he could build hardware too. Or I mean, he could build.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't. When I think of the engineer, I'm just thinking about mixing a board so that the music sounds good. But I mean, there's a lot more to it. When did he first? Was he with the band and was he with them in Egypt, or when did he actually come aboard?
Well, I think that when it came time, I mean, he was already doing, as I told you last time, radio mix things from Winterland in the 70s. But he didn't become a full-time employee until they needed someone to go to Egypt and set up the advance work for the Egyptian experiment. And John was sent to Egypt ahead of everybody else to bring all the stuff there. And that was sort of when he became full-time. And that was an incredible undertaking because, you know, Israel and Egypt were still at war, so there was all of that tension in the Middle East to begin with. Anwar Sadat's wife, had given approval for the Dead to come and play in Egypt, but when John went with all the gear, all the Macintosh amps and stuff, and he got to the airport, you know, the Egyptian authorities were very suspicious, and they didn't want any drugs brought in the country. So John had to disassemble all of the amps right there at the airport.
Oh my.
This is weeks ahead of when the band
my God.
you know, and put it all back together and get all these permits done, and then get permission to get into the Great Pyramid because they wanted to try to use it as an echo chamber. Can you imagine going over to Egypt in that environment and saying, yeah, we'd like to use the pyramid as an echo chamber? I mean, you know, you're talking about a society that's never even had a rock and roll band there before. So he eventually got some of the authorities there to allow him to do that. And, you know, they had to find cabling to run all these cables from the pyramid. And at the time, Egypt was so much more primitive than we think of as a country, that when they looked for cable, they really couldn't find anything he needed until they opened up an old shed and they found cable that was left behind by Rommel and the Nazis when they were fleeing the British, and they gave John that cable.
There were no electronic stores. Yeah.
From the Nazis that were left over. And, you know, it's 1978, you know, and so the cable is so old, and when he unspooled it, you know, most of it wouldn't even hold together, and so they had to give up the idea of using, I think, the pyramid as an echo chamber. But the experience of him actually going to the mat to do all those things convinced the band to put him on full time. And when they got back from Egypt, John was a full-time employee of the Grateful Dead, and from 78 until the end of the band, he was on the crew with you know, Steve Parrish and Winslow and Ramrod and Rex, until Rex had already probably died by then, but, you know, the whole crew.
Right, but was there like a, what a beautiful story. You know, I wanted to just touch on this cat, Craig Paulston. Can you talk about him?
Craig Paulston, oh yeah. Well, Craig was just a wonderful guitar player. What happened was, you know, my band Heroes, which was when Kingfish formed, just to give you some background on this, when Kingfish formed, since I wasn't in that band, although I was writing songs for Kingfish and still good friends with them, I had my own band called Heroes. And that band went through a couple of different lineup changes. But the first guitar player was my friend Scotty Quick, Scotty died of a drug overdose very young. He was 26 or something like that, and it was really tragic. He was a brilliant player who probably would have gone on to be groundbreaking, and we looked at him as like a young Jeff Beck type of guy.
Sure.
He was very forward-thinking, and that was tragic. And after Scotty left the band, we had another wonderful guitar player named Michael O'Neill from Texas. But Michael eventually went back to Texas, and we needed a permanent member. So Craig Paulson came along, who was a young guitar player, great, from down the peninsula, and he joined the band. And he fit in beautifully, and he played terrifically. But strangely, Craig, who was a very clean-living guy, got liver cancer.
Huh.
And in those days, before transplants and the kind of drugs we have today, liver cancer was a death sentence, and literally died within 6 months of his diagnosis. Now, at the time that he died, my band, Heroes, had become a big draw band in San Francisco. This is like 1977, 78, right in there. And it was just, I was so exhausted. This was the third guitar player, two of whom had died incredibly young, and I just didn't know if I had the energy to go on. But at the same moment that he died, or just before it, we were offered the chance to play the very first Haight Street Fair. There hadn't been a permit for bands to play live music on Haight Street since maybe 1969. So it had been close to a decade, and they finally got one. And they decided to put on the first Haight Street Fair. And they asked us to be one of the headlining bands, along with Merle Saunders' band and a few others. But Craig died after we had been given the gig and before we took it, before the actual day came.
Right.
So I was ready to cancel. But Heroes had just come off the road touring with Moby Grape. We had opened a whole slew of shows for Moby Grape in San Francisco and Santa Cruz and stuff. So I got a call from Jerry Miller from Moby Grape, and he said, "Bill, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry about Craig. I hate to see you cancel the gig. Would it be all right if I came and played with you?"
Wow.
And I said, "Oh, my God, that would be so wonderful because we wouldn't have to cancel this thing. It's the first Haight Street Fair. Friends of ours are putting it on, counting on us." So Jerry said, "Sure, I'd love to." So Jerry Miller came and played with us at the first Haight Street Fair, which is in some way almost a wake for our guitar player, Craig,
Yeah.
And we expected, I don't know, 10,000 people, but of course there were 100,000 people because that's the way San Francisco is, and everybody was so dying to have another big experience on Haight Street. It hadn't happened in so long. And in these days, the Haight Street Fair, which is going since 1978, always draws, 100,000 people, but nobody expected it then. So we wound up there as a band that had never actually played together. And I thought, how is Jerry Miller going to pull this off?
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, he had been watching our set from the side of the stage, and he was brilliant. He played incredibly well. The crowd went nuts. We were introduced by Rock Scully, and it was an amazing day. And that was sort of the end of the band Heroes, because we'd been through three guitar players. We sort of peaked, and after that, we all kind of went our separate ways. But it was an amazing end to that period of time. And,
is there like a
something really special.
Is there any recordings of that show?
Well, here's the interesting thing. There's a very rough cassette that was made by a Hell's Angel way back in the crowd.
Wow.
On a primitive cassette deck, but the wind blowing sounds as loud as the music. So it's not really suitable for broadcast.
Sure. Sure.
And what's so funny about it is every time he likes something, he revs his bike, instead of clapping. So, at the end of the song, it's like, and I got a kick out of that. Now, what is interesting is I had never seen any photographs from that day, at all. And I was always very bummed that none existed. But recently, when Rock Scully passed away in December,
right,
I saw a picture on Facebook that was taken by Ed Pearlstein, who's one of the great rock and roll photographers
Absolutely.
of the era. And it said Rock Scully, 1978 Hay Street Fair. So I realized it was a picture of Rock on stage introducing one of the other bands that day, not us. So I realized that if he had taken pictures of Rock, he probably had taken pictures of the band.
Sure.
I contacted Ed Pearlstein, and I asked him if there was any chance he had pictures of Heroes, with me and Jerry Miller and my friend Larry Hunter, who was the bass player at the time, and Chris Harold was the drummer at that time, and Steve Gassick was the keyboard player. All great players.
Larry, that's insane,
I have a bunch, strangely enough. I have 2 or 3 rolls of undeveloped film from that day. And on January 1st of this year,
oh my God,
he posted 4 of the most beautiful shots I have ever seen in my life. Just gorgeous black and white shots of us playing at the Hay Street Fair with Jerry Miller that he found in that roll of film. And they're just incredible. You can just see this gigantic crowd, but they're such clear pictures.
Oh, you got? Did you put those
phenomenal.
up, dude? I'll share those immediately. That is so dope. That is just that's the coolest thing ever.
I know, and I can't thank Ed Pearlstein enough, because here's a guy who's taken pictures of every famous musician ever. He did not need to go back and rifle through 1978 pictures, but he found them. And what's so great about it is it fills in a chapter in my life where I didn't have any evidence of what had happened. Unlike my situation with Jerry Garcia, where there's a few photos and there's the album and there's my video of Starlight Jamboree with Jerry in it and stuff. There was nothing with me and Jerry Miller, even though we're friends and we did this thing together. And finally, there's some wonderful pictures. And it's not just me and Jerry, it's also the other guys in my band, Heroes. It was very much a band. I was the leader of the band, but it was not a backup group.
No, I was going to say that the special thing is just, first of all, Pearlstein, I haven't talked to him, but that guy loves doing stuff like that. He loves going back. But the thing is that,
right.
Because that's what he's passionate about it. And the mere fact that he has it archived so well and that he hung on to it is absolutely a revelation.
Fantastic.
It's unbelievable.
He's always showing phenomenal pictures. But it was just such a strange coincidence that the sad death of Rock Scully, which hit me very hard because I'd known Rock for many years, and he had been very good to us. He had not only had he introduced us at the Hay Street Fair and given us the, all of that cachet that comes from having the manager of the Grateful Dead introducing you, but he also had picked me to play at the Shady Grove later that day for a sort of a special private party, with Dr. John and Mickey Hart and all these other great players. Rock was just, he was very good to me. And so it was very gratifying to have something from that day and all the rest of that,
As we wrap up part 2 here with Bill Cutler, we've already been cooking here for about 55 minutes. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about your songwriting? It's been met with accolades. The people that, Garcia is a perfect example. I think the guy was he got off on your lyrics, and I just wanted you to talk not so much about specific songs or but talk to younger cats about how you work through some harder times in writing, how you overcame it, and then how to be true to yourself in the songwriting process.
Well, I have always used my own life as the basis for how I write my songs. Now, I've written social comment songs, like the title song on Crossing the Line is a social comment song about society, but most of the songs on that record are about really personal things to me. Now, they may have, sometimes I write them literally as they were, and sometimes I write them in an allegorical style, where I will use an image. So, for example, the first time we spoke, I told you about the song Engine 99 that was later turned into the song Home to Dixie that I wrote with
Barlow
and Matthew and Bobby from Kingfisher Act. Well, I took the title Engine 99 and I wrote a new record, a new song about it for my album, in which I allegorically talked about, leaving down the track in Engine 99, because I saw it as a departure to the next part of my life. So, it wasn't a literal interpretation of my life, but it was there. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, on my record, on Crossing the Line, I have Rockingham Mill. And that's a song that I wrote about literally working in the Rockingham Mill in North Carolina in the summer of 1964. Because, when I told my parents I wasn't going to college and I was going to head to Greenwich Village and be a folk singer, they were not exactly thrilled. They said, the problem with you is that you've grown up too easy, and we're going to send you down to North Carolina for the summer, and you're going to work manual labor in a paper mill. And my parents were attorneys, and they represented this mill. And, you're going to learn something. And if you still want to be a folk singer and a rock and roll musician or whatever, when you come out, fine. But if not, you're going to go to college. You got into college, and we'll see you in the fall. So they sent me down on the Seaboard Railway. I worked for 3 months in this mill, and it turned out, by accident, to be the summer of 1964, which was the Mississippi burning summer of the South,
Wow.
with Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney being killed, the 3 civil rights workers. And I was right in the middle of that in the South. And the mill was newly integrated. I didn't fit in with anybody at the mill, but because I was a guitar player, the African-American guys that were loading the boxes onto the cars got friendly with me, and at lunch we would sit and play music.
Oh, that's so fucking cool.
And I had an amazing experience.
Jeez.
So I came home, I wrote the song Rockingham Mill about something that really happened to me. I didn't wind up recording that song until 1975 with Jerry Garcia, but because it was about something real, I could always access the emotion for it. So what I say to people is, you have to write about something that's real for you. You have to write about something that's passionate, that you feel passionately about. You can't just use the mechanics of songwriting to create things and expect them to mean a lot to people. They may become popular. They may have a run. You can have a hit with Who Let the Dogs Out. But it's not going to mean something to people the way that Eyes of the World means to people that love Grateful Dead, or the way Mr. Tambourine Man means something to my generation, or anything like that. If you want to write something great that's really going to stand the test of time, you have to write something real that you believe in, that happened to you, that you can explain, that's your own life. So that's the way I've always approached my songwriting. And I still do. Of course, I write differently now because I have different experiences now, and I've lived a lot more, and I've lost a lot of my friends, and things are different at this age. But I don't feel any less passionate, and I think that's the secret. All my favorite songwriters are like that.
Yeah, no, I think
Jackson Browne is like that.
Right.
Woody Guthrie was like that. They're just Joni Mitchell was like that. Lauren Nero was like that. All of my favorite songwriters are people who write about their own life, or they write about things that they totally understand. And that's what I think people need to do, and that's what's missing right now.
Right, and because you actually have to have real experiences, and like your parents sending you to that paper mill gave you such a visceral experience. People really, if they're not seekers, if they're not really driven to produce and seek, in our society now, there's so much digitization that you can really become a receiver and sort of check out. And I think that for songwriters, it's more about I talked to Narda Michael Walden about it yesterday, but just the harshness of the sound now. It's just like a brick. I mean, he deals with it, but it hits you in the face, and then there's really not a lot of substance on top of that.
Right.
So it's, I mean, anything being played on the radio today. I mean, you might have been playing top 40 stuff with the early versions of Slewfoot or before that, or everybody's playing top 40. But the top 20 stuff you hear on the radio now, it's all digital music. It's all digital. And that has been in the ears of kids that are 20, 25, 30 years old their whole lives. I was lucky enough, being 37, to be at the tail end of that baking of tapes, analog. So it resonates with me, and I can hear the warmth of the barn card. You know, if I can only remember my name, that kind of stuff. You can just hear the way it's mic'd and how warm it is. But the people are lacking substance too. You have to dig deep, and I guess the I don't know what it will look like, but the next cat that, like when Dylan was at Flushing, at the tennis court, Forest Hills. It's like, when that moment comes, we'll know it, but who knows what it will look like.
Yes, well, the one thing you can count on is when music becomes too synthetic and no longer speaks to the heart, something will break through. In the same way that when things got too corporate, you had Nirvana break through with a much raw, more felt sound, and grunge came in. The same way you had punk as a reaction to all of the overproduction that preceded that. And to some degree, the sterility of music today is going, I think, in the wrong direction. Now, I love modern technology. My album, Crossing the Line, probably couldn't have been made before Pro Tools was invented because there was so much work to be done. But I began that record on analog, and I only put it into Pro Tools later on for other things. I kept the original analog tracks, and I still prefer to record that way, but most of the time, because budgets are so tight, we don't get to it. However, you can make digital records that do not sound sterile, and they're made every day by really talented people who grew up in the age of analog and know how to work in the digital medium, what kind of signal path to use, what kind of microphones, what kind of compressors, what kind of EQ, in order to make great records. Gary Mankin, who's one of my favorite engineers, does a great job of that. All kinds of people do a great job of that. So it can be done. The trouble is people opt for the easy way out.
Right.
You get a young band and they tell you that they worship, the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds. And then you take them in the studio, and instead of giving you a real performance, they want to cut the verse and have you paste it 4 times. And you go, I can do that, but all the bands that you admire actually perform their music in the studio. So why don't you give me something with a real performance and let me correct a mistake if you make one, but let's hear how you really want to do this.
Yeah, right. Let's stretch out. Stretch out a little bit.
Harder the third time. That's because you feel it that way.
That's younger generation. That's
passion.
But that's a value. That's younger generations. That's my generation and younger generations. With the easy access. Listen, your brother went to Egypt. There wasn't an Ace Hardware to find those wires. He had to find the Nazi wires. Today, I bet he could go and find those wires somewhere. But the point is that things are so easily accessible now. You're also and they're also people, younger cats.
Everybody with a microphone and a computer thinks they're George Martin.
Well, the other thing is that, but the truth is that
a lot more than that.
Right. Well, the younger, and listen, my phone battery might die. If it does, have a beautiful night. But I just want to finish by saying that you guys had to stretch out, and you had opportunities on the bandstand to do that and get comfortable with your own sound. Younger cats, not so much. Really not. They don't have that opportunity to play live. They don't have a chance to really hone their sound. And so when they get into the studio, they do something good for 5 minutes, and they're like, okay, we're done. We can just do the rest, cut and paste. That's the way it is, And so, the first people that say, no, we want to do the whole thing, or those next groups, it's also really hard to keep a really solid band together for any extended period of time now, too. It's an interesting, Continue.
Yeah, I understand that that's absolutely true. And capturing the performance, for me, is still what's best about recording. All the technical stuff is great. When you get right down to it, there's nothing as great as a great performance.
We're going to leave it there. Bill Cutler, what an honor again, man. I hope you had a good time.
I had a great time. Always good to talk to you, Jake.
All right, Bill. Have a good night, man.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.